Hi, everyone, and welcome to another special edition of the Social Wave Project podcast and the Titanic special. So, from yesterday, I've been talking to Loretta about all the women who have been lost to the Titanic, but I've decided to jump onto this because I wanted to have a look at a very special rule. Well, not so special rule. That was the big rule of the sea at one time. And I do apologize if I can't pronounce things a bit properly. But who better to actually have a sit down and a discussion with is Jake. Jake, hello.
Hello.
I see that even though it's April, you still got your Christmas tree up.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, you can't really go wrong because it's
No, you
November
can't.
when we're recording. So
Exactly.
I mean, it's definitely like a lovely Christmas tree. But
Yeah,
I know when we're getting to Christmas, but it's too early for Christmas now.
it is.
So Jake is a historian, and if you have come across him before, then you'll probably know what Jake does. But Jake, would you like to jump in and tell us more about yourself as well?
Yeah. Well, I started researching the Titanic a good 20 years ago. Um, it was actually 1997 when I fell in love with the Titanic. I watched James Cameron's movie, and it just went on from there. It's as if I was the only one. There was three of us that was watching Titanic at the time, and my tiny brothers just couldn't understand what was going on. But I was only one out of the three that was crying, and I wanted to learn more. It was as
Oh,
if Titanic sort of shackled her anchor chains at my heart, and I just wanted to learn more. And then it went on to expand onto not just the Titanic, but also I found out about Britannic, Titanic sister, then the Olympic, and then the Lusitania, and it just went on from there. I've joined, many Facebook groups. I've helped out on um, Britannic books, at least one in particular, which was a Patricia Wilson book, which came out just this past April, just gone, April 2021, and it was a novel about the Britannic, and I helped with the history of that book, and it's called Summer in Greece. It's called, and I've also helped out with other like-minded historical groups and dive groups as well who have dived these ships. So it's been an amazing journey, and I'm just constantly learning. I'm not an expert. I never claim to be an expert, but we're always constantly learning. But I like to share with the community what I've learned, and then they can teach me too. And it's just a great community to be in. And Titanic just is always there, always in my heart, and it always will be.
I mean, it's such a shocker, really, because every person that I've interviewed, they say that the James Cameron film is the one that inspired their fascination with the Titanic, which
Mm,
is no surprise, really.
it
But
is,
I'm starting to
yeah,
see a pattern. But
yeah.
when you mentioned Britannic, you said to me, really, that you actually visited the shipwreck of the Britannic, didn't you?
I haven't, no,
No?
but I know I haven't, no, but I know a lot of people that have. Unfortunately, it hasn't actually been an opportunity of mine that's ever fell into my lap or I've ever been invited to. I've had people who want me to go and and say, let's, but it's just Britannic. You've got to be in the right place at the right time, and you have to be the right people. You have to meet the right people at the right time, and then they get you to Britannic. You see, Britannic is protected under the Greek government. You can't just go out there and dive. You have to have special skills to be able to get there. Such as you have to be a technical diver to be able to dive the ship, because even though she's 400 feet down, she's still pushing the limits of human capability. So you have to be very, very skilled to be able to be at that wreck. But yes, I would love to one day. I hope to get down to that wreck and see her from my own eyes.
I
Yeah.
think I must have gotten confused really because that's if you didn't see was it the Lusitania? Oh no,
The
you didn't.
Lusitania. I was supposed to, in fact, I was supposed to go to the Lusitania this past August, but unfortunately, with me moving house and my brother also was also getting married in this past August just gone. Unfortunately, I was unable to go. My personal life just didn't warrant me going, and I just couldn't get there because there was just so much going on. But I have been invited back if if they were to go back this it was a dive team called the DMV Tenors Group. They're they're a British and American dive team, and they actually recently discovered the Britannic Bell, the crow's nest bell. They went on a dive to the Britannic in May 2019, and they discovered the bell, which had been lost for since the day that she went down. Nobody knew. You know, she was
Wow.
discovered in 1976. People blamed Jacques Cousteau for stealing the bell, and they actually found it on the bottom of the sea.
Oh,
So
really?
I was going with that team to Lusitania, but unfortunately I couldn't go. But hopefully next time. In fact, Simon Mills, who owns the wreck, said, "You know, when I get to heaven one day, I owe Jacques Cousteau an apology because he thought that Jack had taken the bell on his dive to the ship. But because unfortunately Jacques Cousteau is no longer with us. He died in 1997. I mean, he was 70 years old when he found the Britannic. So he was really getting on in age. He was born in 1910. So he was getting on in age at that time. So in fact, he is second oldest to dive a wreck to this day.
We're
Yeah.
going to jump straight on to
Okay.
like today's because I have like a little something to actually begin with. And Jake, I don't know if you know this one, but last year I went
Mm.
to Bridport and there was this wonderful old vintage shop that sells books, and I was trying desperately to look at a book on Titanic,
Mm.
and I couldn't find one anywhere. So I said to the lady, "Have you got any Titanic books or sea related?" And she suggested to me this book. So this book I found is called Sea Law and Sea Power, and it was written by an
Mm.
MP called T. Gibson Bowles. I think that's how you pronounce it, right?
Yeah.
And this book, it was published in 1910, so 2 years before the Titanic disaster. And
Mm.
it's so creepy because what he says really is his definition of
Mm.
how the rules of the sea are are actually created, and they should stay this way. And you're looking about in the time really before you actually think about the rules of the sea. But even though he was mentioning only the trade deals between England and France at the time, it's all complicated because they were
Yeah.
based off of Parliament laws that went passed through in the early 1900s. But I wanted to open with this quote because this is something that really spooked me out, and this is probably one bit there, but from the preference, what he put in the beginning, he said, "From all the time, the sea has been calling to the land, and the land has not heeded. From I can't remember how to pronounce it. Pio Senna, I think that's how you pronounce
Yeah.
it, but I'll go with that. To England, from Thai of the Barraman Islands to London, Liverpool, and Glasgow of the British Islands, from Salamis and Actamin to the inconceivable Armada and Trafalgar, the sea has shown itself the superior of the land. If only the landsmen could be made to understand how to use the seaman. The lesson of all history is that whether in peace for trading or in war for fighting, the sea has always dominated the land. That in war, most especially, knaves are more potent than armies. The tradient a mightier weapon than the sword." Now, I apologise if I got some names a bit wrong because
Mm.
even though it's like 19th century, they still use words that we don't really use today.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this is a really clear example of
Mm,
how man is so confident about the rules of the sea and how it should be. And this is the
mm.
one thing that really got me interested in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, people. I mean, humans were getting a bit cocky. Excuse my French, but they were getting a bit thingy with the sea. I mean, they built their ships and they thought they'd beat Mother Nature, and there's no way that the sea could dominate them anymore in it. But Mother Nature will always have the upper hand over man and over technology. And I mean, anything we build or anything is fallible. The Titanic teaches you that. But again, people thought that back in those days that they had beaten Mother Nature and that
Mm.
they'd ruled the sea. They
But
hadn't.
no, they haven't. They really, really
No,
haven't.
no.
I was really talking about this as well to David Heisman the other day, who was in like the previous episode, and he
Yeah,
said exactly the same thing. And I know I've mentioned to him a lot in the past few
yeah,
episodes, but he really gave a really clear example of this because you think, and especially during times of COVID as well, man seems to actually feel more confident about their ways of living.
yeah.
And since nature doesn't have her own voice, she kind of feels like bullied in a way.
Oh yeah, she's very bullied by us, by the humans. I mean, even to this day, she's bullied. We think that Mother Nature, but people forget what happened to the dinosaurs. They were taken out by Mother Nature. With all these wars and global warming and things. And there's another example. You know, global warming. Again, Mother Nature has the upper hand over us humans. We may try to slow it down. We may try to control it slightly, but you can't stop it. It's the whole cycle of it's the way the earth it's the way the earth that's where we are just as I say, we are the tenants of the earth. We haven't taken care of it, we haven't looked after it, but we're the we are the caretaker. We, in a sense, we are the caretakers. We're the tenants. We bully Mother Nature, but what we forget, she has the upper hand. She's more powerful than us. So it doesn't matter what we do, Mother Nature's gonna win in the end.
Oh
So
yeah, definitely. I
yeah.
really couldn't agree more. That's very well said, really, because I know that it's so hard to not ignore, and I
Yeah.
know through some of the examples of this is like looking through the history of what's happened, and I decided to have a chat with Jake about a theory that I decided to like to come up with, but unfortunately it took me such a long time to get over it. And one of the things we're going to be touching on really is the rules of the sea law, what went wrong, which is something to do with the Titanic. But
Mm.
although it focuses on some people, the third class was the one I really wanted to look into, especially with the women and children rule. So, with the history of the famous women and children first,
Mm.
it was actually traced back to an event called the Brickhead Drill. So, Jake, do you know anything about the Brickhead Drill? Drill?
Yeah, it was very similar to the Titanic because it was the women and children first thing, and unfortunately, because of this, so many men and that drowned and died in this, and it was just unfortunate. And you'd have thought that okay, that would have changed by the time the Titanic had come round, but it hadn't, not really. And with the Titanic, unfortunately, people think, oh yeah, it was all mother and it was women and children first. It wasn't actually, wasn't because it was on one side of the ship, but it wasn't on the other. You
Mm,
see, Captain Smith gave the order women and children first, not only, but they should go first. But you see, Lightoller sort of put that as that's it. Women and children first. That's it. No men, nothing. That was Lightoller. That was on the port side of the ship. But Murdoch wasn't. He was allowing men into the boats. So it wasn't. So it was like a mixed communication. And with third class, a lot of people think with third class that you know, they were kept down below. They were not allowed behind closed doors or locked doors. That wasn't the case. See, some of these gates were locked anyway, even during the voyage. They weren't locked purposely to keep third class below decks. They were locked anyway, and they just were never opened, in the confusion of it all. Unfortunately, what happened with the Titanic is that you had a mix of everybody from different countries. The crew were confused because there wasn't that, okay, this is what's happening, you need to get these people. No, even the crew were a bit like, hold on, what do we do? And they didn't know what they were doing. They did not understand. Some of them just did not understand the severity of what was going on. And unfortunately, what happened is there was no lifeboat drill. There was supposed to be a lifeboat drill on the Sunday, but got cancelled. Now, not like today where you have like plans of the ship to show you how to get to one deck to the other. Third class had never been up on the boat deck because it wasn't their deck. They'd never been up to second class because they'd never been up there. They wouldn't know how to get up there. They never boarded that way. That's it. And also because of the class structure, when they saw some people just couldn't pass themselves, go by gates that said first class only or second class only, because that's how the class structure works, and they just could not pass those doors. So it was just a mixture of confusion and what was going, and they just didn't know what to do or where to go, or the crew didn't advise anybody where to go or how to get up to a deck, or there was a classic case of the Article 14 where they were hoisting women and themselves from one deck to the other, just climbing decks because they just didn't know how to get up to that deck other than climb over actual decks, and over railings. And yet the craziest thing is, all they had to do, third class, and this is amazing because if you think back, well, you had Scotland Road, which is what the park, which the crew called Park Avenue, which literally ran sort of the length of the ship. They could have gone straight down that corridor and up to first class and through. That's how they could have done it, or they could have gone up through. So they could have gone up through the third class general room, and where they'd been, which would have been an easy access up to the top decks. But again, it was just the confusion, and and the women and children thing wasn't an exact strict rule on the Titanic. It was on with Lightoller, but it wasn't with the other. And so men who survived the night had Murdoch to thank, but not Lightoller. In fact, only one man was ever let into a lifeboat by Lightoller, which was a man called Puchin, who incidentally, while trying to get into a lifeboat, dropped his wallet and it fell to the sea floor. When they actually found his wallet in the debris field. Of all the things that they could have found, they found his wallet. And think about it. I mean, how if it was only women and children on the Titanic, strictly. So how did Ismay? How was he allowed on the boat? Because he was a man. He was on the right side of the ship. He was on the starboard side. He was on Murdoch's side, so Murdoch allowed him. If he'd been on the port side with Lightoller, Ismay would not have been allowed in a lifeboat because he wasn't allowing men in. But Murdoch was. So Ismay found himself on the right side of the ship. And it was on Murdoch's side who was allowing men into boats. Lightoller took it as women and children only, and that's it, no men. Murdoch didn't. So it was just it was how he interpreted that order from Captain Smith.
Thinking about what you said there, Jake, it kind of looks like it's divided into two minds. And with the disaster of the Brickenhill disaster, I know I didn't really say it right. Let's see. With the Brickenhill disaster, it was kind of like how women and children came about. It was kind of like a romanticized version.
That's how it was. Yeah.
And it was it was kind of like romanticized, really, of how the situation is hopeless. So the men decided to bring all the women and children into the boats, and all
Yeah,
the children and women survived, but
and
the
then
men didn't.
the men stayed back. Yeah,
Yeah, and
that's just how the rule was. It was the times they lived in, because women and they saw women and children in a way a weaker sex, in a way weaker thingy. So they men were stronger. They thought they were stronger, and they saw themselves as, so they stood back and they could take anything. Women and children couldn't, so they had to. It was their survival. That's how, because they thought women could, but again, evolution again, women have shown through history that they're a stronger sex, or a strong sex, compared to, or at least equal to men. I mean, Florence Nightingale, and people like Violet Jessop, and Margaret Brown, and these amazing women that have done amazing things, and in some ways done better than in some ways than men. And because it, someone said, and I can't remember who it was, but men start wars, women just clean up after them. That's true, because men start wars. I mean, look at Adolf Hitler. He started a war. He was
yeah,
a man, and women, they cleaned up after the men. I mean, the women stayed at home with the kids, and women became nurses and basically cleaned up after the men, and cleaned up the men's mess in a way. It wasn't a woman that started war, but 10,000. That's it. 10,000 fleets sweep over the in vain. Men's control stops at the shore. It's that is just a powerful thing. It's like, you know, women are strong, and that's what it was. Like you said, it's the romance of it all, of women and children first, because men were, putting themselves, putting women before themselves, and making sure they got off safely because they thought they were weaker sex, but they weren't, and so on
no.
and so on. It, but then people thought, okay, well, that's how the Titanic was, and it wasn't, not really.
It does sound to me, really, that it's always like complicated between when you look at like fiction and non-fiction, if you put two and two together.
Yeah,
But looking at all of that, really, I realized that when you think about like a third class and how they survived, because third class had the second highest percentage of passengers who tragically lost their lives in the sinking. And this
yeah,
was really interesting because the total percentage of passengers and crew who survived was, I believe, 31.6%, where the average percentage of people who could have been saved, given the number of spaces that were available on the Titanic's lifeboats, was
mm.
53.4%.
Yeah. I mean, more people could have survived that night. I mean, the Titanic's lifeboats had room for at least 1,200 people. But unfortunately, what happened was is Titanic was unsinkable, or at least that's how she was sold. That's how she was perceived, not by the designers as much, but by the press. The press had got hold of the unsinkable, and that's how,
Mm,
as like today, the press thinks for people, at least, or at least that's, we look at something and think, oh, but no, it's what they call yellow journalism. What the designers said was that she was practically unsinkable. They didn't say she was unsinkable. White Star. I mean, the White Star Line in Holland and Wolf made sure that safety on the ship was paramount. That they made sure that the ship was safe, or at least was safe enough. And Holland and Wolf and White Star Line paid more money to keep the Titanic afloat for as long as possible. And if you look at it, Titanic did act as she was supposed to do, what she was built for. She stayed. I mean, Thomas Andrews, when the Titanic had struck the iceberg, he did his calculations, and he gave the ship an hour or an hour and a half to stay afloat. But the Titanic lasted 2.5. Now, okay, yeah, she sank, but she stayed afloat a lot. She was acting as her own lifeboat that night. if that take now if the calculations had gone the way that is Andrews had calculated, more people would have died, because that type of class of ship, she rolls onto her side, and that's what she was going to do. She was going to roll onto her starboard side and go down, and she was going to go down a lot quicker.
Yeah, I've heard
But
about that because that was mentioned in a documentary about if the watertight doors were all open.
yeah, no, not really. I mean,
Oh,
the watertight doors, no, I mean they were there to keep the water out. They weren't meant to keep the water in
oh,
and to flow through the ship. No, it was actually the fire that was on the Titanic that
oh yeah, the
night,
coal bunker
or at least
fire.
during the voyage. It was a coal bunker fire. Now, people have blown that out of proportion and thought, okay, that's what caused the Titanic to sink, or it sank it quicker. No, actually, it didn't. In fact, if anything, it kept it afloat a lot longer, because during the voyage, the Titanic had a three-degree list. The only person to notice this was Lawrence Beasley, second class passenger Lawrence Beasley. He noticed through the voyage that the ship was leaning sort of to one side, that the horizon, when he looked out the porthole, his porthole, the ship just wasn't level with the horizon. What was happening is men in the boiler rooms were getting the fire out. And it wasn't a fire as a fire, it was a smouldering fire. So it was intense heat. And people think that she damaged a watertight bulkhead. She didn't. It was a watertight coal bunker wall, which wasn't supposed to be watertight, wasn't supposed to keep water out. It was supposed to keep coal in. Um, and that didn't break. That broke, that collapsed, but it wasn't watertight, wasn't supposed to be, wasn't designed that way. And fires on these ships were quite common. It was a it was a coal ship, and you're going to expect fires. In fact, Charles Bartlett was on a ship in his earlier career, when he not long started the White Star Line, and his ship caught fire. These ships do. It's expected. And but during the voyage, what they were doing was they were putting the coal from one side of the ship onto the other, which made the ship slightly heavier on one side. So when the Titanic struck the iceberg and she was flooding on the starboard side, the weight shifted, and it shifted onto the port side, which sort of counteracted of what was actually going to happen to the Titanic. She was starting to roll onto a starboard side because she started to develop very early on in the sinking a starboard roll. But because of this extra weight, she was rolling onto the other side, which counteracted. And it was as if, in a sense, the ship itself was rejecting the water that was coming into her. She was behaving what she was designed to do. The ship was built with 1.5 thick steel plating. She was built like a battleship. I mean, even the glass in the portholes was thick. Um, they didn't spare any money on this ship. They made sure what was it in the worst case scenario, that she'd be able to stay afloat and get people off in plenty of time. But unfortunately, the British Board of Trade was out of date. In fact, it was out of date more than 10 years by the time Titanic was built. The British Board of Trade was the last time it was looked at, and thingy was which was March 1894, and in March 8, and that's the last time it was ever looked at. That was the last time it was ever changed. And the rules were that any ship up to 10,000 tons was allowed to carry up to around about 20 lifeboats, or 16 in some cases. But on Titanic, but anything above that, above 10,000 tons, was only allowed to carry a minimum of 16 lifeboats. Titanic was actually breaking the law. She was breaking the law by carrying 4 more than she was supposed to carry by law. White Star Line and, well, at least Harland and Wolff argued with the British Board of Trade that these ships were getting larger and more passengers were sailing on them, which means that they would need more, they would need more lifeboat space and more lifeboats.
I'm going to jump onto that, Jake, because I actually found out a quote that I was looking at the other day, and
Mm,
I saved it just because that I really wanted to look at. Because when you mentioned about lifeboats and then breaking the law with the Titanic adding like
yeah.
4 additional collapsible lifeboats, the story goes that Lord Peary, who was the chairman of the White Star Line, he wanted more additional boats because of this,
Mm,
and he had an argument with Ismay about it, and then Lord Peary actually left, and then his nephew, which is Thomas Andrews, who you mentioned earlier, Jake,
yeah.
he came in and he proposed the same idea, but Ismay was having none of it. He was having
No.
none of it. And the reason
No.
why he said this quote was because that it's a bit of a mystery. Either he was sticking to his guns because he didn't want to break the law, or if he still had in his mind he wants to do it. End of. Once his mind's made up, you cannot undo it. And I think it was during a meeting, but with the quote that Ismay said, he
Mm,
actually had a snap at Thomas Andrews. He said to him, "Control your Irish passions, Thomas. Your uncle here tells me you proposed 64 lifeboats and he had to pull your arm to get you down to 32. Now,
yeah.
I will remind you, just as I reminded him, these are my ships. And according to our contract, I have the final say on the design. I won't have so many little boats, as you call them, cluttering up my decks and putting fear into my passengers."
Thomas Andrews tried to argue not only with Ismay but also with the British Board of Trade, and they came back with, "Well, is your ship safe or isn't it safe? Because obviously, if you want more lifeboats on a ship, then your ship isn't safe." And that's how Ismay perceived it, because Ismay thought, well, if these people see these lifeboats all stacked up on the decks, it's going to frighten them. It's going to scare them away. It isn't going to sell your ship very well that you need all these lifeboats. The British Board of Trade was so out of date. Ismay, in fact, if I remember correctly, Alexander Carlisle, who was Lord Peary's brother-in-law, who was actually the Olympic class liner's original designer. Andrews was sort of there as a, you know, there to help design these ships, but he was the chief, uh, Alexander Carlisle, and Alexander Carlisle also argued that the Titanic was getting these ships were getting larger, and they needed more lifeboats. And even he said, I mean, how are you going to get these? You're going to get 3,000 people traveling on these ships. How are you going to get 3,000 people traveling or getting 3,000 people off in 16 lifeboats? You're not. The davits on the Titanic was designed to take more lifeboats. There was supposed to be a lifeboat stacked up on top of the other, and you know, Lord Peary was singing to Ismay's tune. Ismay was singing. They were in sort of cahoots really. And Alexander Carlisle said, "I'm done. I've had enough. I'm going. I don't want any more to do with this." And he left the company and he retired, and he had nothing else to do with the design of the Olympic class liners. The only time that Alexander Carlisle had anything to do with these ships ever again was when Titanic had gone down, and he was called up to the inquiry because Thomas Andrews had gone down with the Titanic, so he's not around anymore. So they needed someone who knew how these ships were designed, and that was Carlisle because he was the original chief. But yeah, Ismay was kind of more thinking about the profits, the money, and how, from his perspective, how these passengers were gonna perceive the ship if they had it, if these all these lifeboats were stacking up on the decks and they hadn't got. He was more thinking about the first class passengers. I mean, he was thinking about deck space and they need how they're going to be walking around when you got all these lifeboats in their way. But the irony of it is that if the Titanic had more lifeboats with these David designs, would actually have probably caused more problems, because as the Titanic is sinking, you've got one lifeboat stacked on top of the other. You'd have had to, and the way these welling davits were designed was that you would have to crank one in and crank it out again and attach the lifeboat, then get the passengers in the lifeboat in the first place. And that was all the other irony of it, is that because the Titanic was unsinkable, or at least she was claimed to be unsinkable, the passengers wouldn't get into the lifeboats. I mean, very early on in the sinking, they thought, well, why should I leave my husband? Why should I leave this, ship that's all lit up? You got the music going, you got the ambience of it all. Why would you expect me to get into a lifeboat in the middle of the night? It's freezing cold when the ship is perfectly safe. And in many cases as well, they were saying, well, if there's anything wrong with the ship, it's going to take a while for it to sink, or help's going to get here in time. They just were not understanding the severity of the situation they were in. And in some cases, it was kind of too late. And part of, officers were trying to get the passengers into the lifeboat, trying to encourage them, but they just wouldn't go. And some of the officers said were frightened of these lifeboats because they thought, well, you've got this davit that's attached to the deck, to a wooden deck, and the more weight you add to the lifeboat, they're going to just collapse. They're just going to break off the deck, or the boat's going to. So they thought overloading them, thought it was a dangerous thing, because they thought the boats wouldn't be able to handle the weight, or the davits wouldn't be able to handle the weight. And Thomas Andrews said, well, these boats were tested in Belfast with a weight of 70 men. So these boats they already had been tested with more than 70 men, 70 big, strong, grown men, and they were able to lower the lifeboats and pick them back up with full success, with no danger to life. And it's just unfortunate. It's like I've said, disasters are a thing of, it's a chain event. It's start to finish, and there's always something that leads up to so many deaths. And whether that's just blind ignorance or blind, I mean, like I said, from a 21st century point of view, we could say, well, I could have done this differently, or I would have done that differently. But would you? Not in 1912. 2021 or 2022 is we're coming up to. Yes, but not in 1912. The rules, people were blind and they were naive back then. And because the Titanic hadn't happened yet, it had to take a Titanic disaster for us to wake up. It had to, as much as it's horrible to think of, but it had to happen for us to learn, for us to wake up. And because if Titanic hadn't gone down, Britannic would have been compromised, thinking that she sank only 4 years later. You imagine if the Britannic had had the same lifeboat design, same amount of lifeboats and everything, what would have happened to, the nurses and doctors? Maybe more than 30 lives would have been lost. Who knows? Or it could have, I mean, she sank in 55 minutes. But then you've got to look at on the other side. Then you got to look at Lusitania. Lusitania did learn from the Titanic disaster, and so did many other ships. And nearly 1,200 people went down with that. And she had enough lifeboats for everybody on board. Unfortunately, the irony of it is that a ship never waits for anybody. The ship's going to go down. It's going to go down. It's not going to wait for no one. And the Lusitania sank in less than 20 minutes. Well, she less than 20 minutes. And only 6 of her 48 lifeboats that were on the ship were ever successfully launched. Part of that was also the davit design, because the list to the ship caused so many lifeboats to either collapse and just fall from the davits, or just slide. And it was just an impossible situation. And it's like I said at the beginning, as humans can try and alter destiny and alter Mother Nature, or at least try to, in a sense, bully her, but she's always going to have the upper hand.
Mm.
And the Lusitania, Titanic, the Wilhelm Gustloff, and all them are a beacon, or at least a poignant reminder that Mother Nature is the stronger party in all this,
Oh yeah,
and a ship is
definitely.
not going to wait for you.
Mm.
If a ship's got a hole in it and it's taking on water, and you can't just say, wait a minute, I've got to get these people into a lifeboat. It ain't gonna wait.
Mm.
And but the Titanic, you would think that she would. I mean, she sank in 2.5 hours. You think they'd have had enough time, but and they didn't. And in a sense, I mean, you think about it, you know, um, Titanic had 20 lifeboats. Two of those lifeboats had to be floated off as the ship sank. So even with the extra lifeboats she did have, two lifeboats had to be floated off because they just had no time to get them into a davit and launch them. That was part of the way they were set up. I mean, they were set up on on the officer's deck, officer's roof, the officer's quarters roof, and there was no way of practically getting them down. They had to slide them down on oars and literally throw them off the roof in a way. And they had no time to do that, and then one landed upside down. They had no time to do that, and then crank it. Well, attach it to a davit and then crank it. But Murdoch tried, because on the wreck, the number one davit is cranked inwards, so you can see that's a monument to his efforts to try and launch this lifeboat
Okay.
that couldn't be launched.
Mm. I
Um,
never knew about that. That's really
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Mm.
On if you look at on the wreck towards the bow on the starboard side, lifeboat davit number one, it's cranked inwards. It's
Ah.
cranked inwards because it's a monument to Murdoch's efforts to try and crank this lifeboat into its position to be launched, to be cranked out. So it was just horrible. Unfortunately, it was horrible.
It is really awful when you think about it, really. And
Yeah,
then when the British inquiry happened, because everyone knows really, there's been trials and tribulations, not just in the
yeah,
British
yeah,
inquiry, but in the American
yeah,
inquiry as well. And there was loads
yeah.
of debates about it. But after the inquiries, both of them came to conclusion, and that the reason why the disaster happened was that there was no proper equipment or a shortage of equipment.
Mm,
The standards and the rules were outdated. There was no emergency backup, and that includes the Californian probably assuming not coming to the Titanic's
yeah.
aid, and then. Oh, what else was there? The protocol to get people into lifeboats are the cancellation of the safety drill and everything else in between. But that actually came up to the very first International Convention for Safety, Life and Sea, and
Mm,
that was conceived in London, but it changed to all over the world.
yeah.
But in that, it included the Ice Patrol.
Yes, the International Ice Patrol that was set up in Nova Scotia, Canada. Uh, it was set up in 1914 in the wake of the Titanic, and what they're able to do now is track icebergs in the shipping lanes, and that um, unfortunately, what happened with around the Titanic was that Titanic had to rely on other reports from other ships from what they had seen up ahead of them. The wireless machine on the Titanic was not used for well, it was used for what it was supposed to be used for, but if it had been used for safety, things things might have been a little bit different, because the crew would have taken these ice warnings slightly more seriously. In a way, they did. Captain Smith did take a notice of one, and he actually pulled the Titanic further south because he thought that the further south he went, the less icebergs he's going to come across. Wasn't the case. when the Ice Patrol was set up in 1914, they would be able to radio a ship. They'd be able to see an iceberg and the, in the shipping lanes. They'd be able to track that iceberg, and they'd be able to warn the oncoming vessels the ice was ahead of them, so they could change their course and avoid that ice. But unfortunately, with the Titanic, they didn't have that luxury. It was only set up afterwards. When the Titanic had gone down, Britannic, yard number 433, was just starting her construction, and she started to get her ribs. I mean, they hadn't even got up to the tank top yet. So she was very early on in construction. I mean, the construction only started in November 1911. So she was very early, which was, in a way, a good thing, because they could now, because once they'd heard the Titanic had gone down, all work stopped on that ship completely. It was just eerily quiet in that shipyard. There was no clanging, normal clanging of the steel, or no, nothing. There was just nothing. It was just silent. And what they were doing was they were waiting for the findings of both inquiries of what needed to be changed. So what they found with the Britannic is that they could put an extra skin of steel around the hull. So she had a double hull. They did this with the Olympic. They pulled her in. They put these gantry davits on the ship, and they were like big crane, like arm crane things. And they were very expensive to fit. They were very expensive equipment to have, very heavy. Britannic had to be modified. See, a lot of people think, well, why didn't Olympic have these, gantry davits? But the Britannic did. The reason being is because, one, Britannic was widened. So she was 94 instead of 92 foot in width. She was strengthened in 8 different places to have these gantry davits. And she was also stiffened in places to be able to take the weight of these gantry davits. If the Olympic had taken these gantry davits, she'd have been top heavy and should have just rolled over. And she wouldn't, and the deck space, she wouldn't have had the deck space for these gantry davits. So they kept the idea of the welling davits on the Olympic, because they did sort of work on the Titanic. They worked. They got people off. I mean, yes, not the amount of people that should have got off, but they did manage to successfully launch lifeboats. So they kept the welling davits because they were a working product. They worked. But what they did with Olympic is that they put more lifeboats on her. But unfortunately, there was a sort of a disagreement with in fact, the crew, they didn't want to work on the Olympic. They was like, nope, not touching it, because the lifeboats that they'd put on had been taken off older vessels, and they were old and horrible, and they were falling apart. They were no good. They were not seaworthy. And because of what happened to the Titanic, the crew on the Olympic would not touch the Olympic. They would not go on it because they were scared of their safety. How would you get off if anything happened to the ship? How would you get off safely? You couldn't, because the lifeboats are not seaworthy. They would just fall apart.
Something came up into my mind, and it was used in the British inquiry as well, because I heard this recently, but for the Olympic, they actually did some sea trial runs in the Harland and Wolff shipyard for the Olympic, because
they did.
The inquiries wanted to pretend that the Olympic was the Titanic, so they can understand of how the collision happened.
Yes, that's right. They did. They used Olympic as a guinea pig in a way as the Titanic. They put her through. They looked at the watertight bulkheads and the compartments and how the watertight doors, the system came down, how that would secure the ship. They looked at everything, the lifeboats, everything that was to do with safety on that ship, and how the Titanic would have turned from the. So they did maneuvering tactics and everything. They did everything, stopping distances and you name it, they did it, because essentially Olympic was Titanic. She was sort of the same ship. Um, there were sister ships, but there were differences, But she behaved in the same way. She had the same type of rudder and everything. It was just. So they did this, and during that time, uh, they they found that she was okay. She was fine. The rudder was fine because people thought, well, rudder might have been well, it was too small, but it wasn't. That was just a myth. It wasn't small. It was fine. In fact, Olympic, she was classed as seaworthy, and the only thing that was done to her was that she had an extra skin of steel added to her, like Britannic, because of in case she struck an iceberg, just like the Titanic. Um, Bulkheads went higher, and obviously that was a fault because the bulkheads didn't have no tops to protect the water from flowing from one compartment to the next, and so on and so on. She actually had the same system, and so what they essentially did with Britannic, they did that with Olympic, uh, just obviously minus the gantry davits. But like I said, there was a mutiny on the Olympic between the crew that they would not sail on the ships. In fact, the crew were arrested for the mutiny. Yes, they were, but they were later released. Thankfully, they were later released with no charges against them. But they did get arrested for basically going against. They were supposed to work, and they weren't, and they got arrested for it. But they were left. They were released on all charge. There were no charges against them. But
It
they
sounds like
that's
an act of
but that's
sabotage.
it is, and it's because you know if it was me, I'd have done the same. I have no because I'm going to be working on the ship, and it's the same as the Titan. I mean, she's a mirror image of the Titanic. If the Titanic could go down, then this is going to go down too. If it comes across an iceberg or anything like that. But like I said, the mutiny was cancelled. I mean, they went back to work on the Olympic because the White Star Line did eventually put seaworthy lifeboats on the vessel,
Mm.
and you know, but you know, but like I said, with Britannic, what they needed to do was prevent this from happening again with the Britannic. And Britannic, like I said, with all she had all the safety. There was even a phone added from the bridge to the wireless machine, to the wireless room, so that
Oh.
the captain didn't have to leave the bridge to ring for help. The wireless machine was used for what it was supposed to be used for, safety. So things did change. But unfortunately, what happened with the Britannic? I mean, these gantry davits. I mean, people think, well, gantry davits, these ugly looking crane things on a ship that's supposed to be used for passenger service. You see, yes, they were ugly. They were not supposed to be pretty. They were, White Star Line were not outlooksing. They were not going to outlooks the competition with these gantry davits. They were there for safety, for one purpose, safety, to stop what happened to the Titanic happening again to this vessel and any other vessel. And the gantry davits acted as they were supposed to be, and they swiftly got everybody off the Britannic as she went down in 1916. So again, it's an evolution of what happened to the Titanic that followed on with other vessels. The Carpathia, as well herself, the rescue ship of the Carpathia, added more lifeboats. The Cunard were not waiting for the findings of the inquiry. They had their ship straight in, and then they altered their ship. They specifically altered the stern just to fit more lifeboats on the vessel.
Oh, good for
Um,
Cunard. Good for
so
them.
Cunard were really onto it, and but you got to imagine at this time, uh, Cunard had built the Lusitania, Mauretania, and the Mauretania and Lusitania were also, you know, carrying less lifeboats than what they should have been. Now, this looks bad for Cunard specifically because Cunard were building ships not only for passenger service, but also military service, auxiliary cruisers. So it didn't look great, because you've got a ship that's supposed to be built for more than one purpose. So they needed to get onto it, and you know, as I say, stick it to the man, and and get these lifeboats on. And unfortunately, what happened with the Britannic and Lusitania was wrong place, wrong time. If the Lusitania had sank slowly and more slower than just like the Titanic, lifeboats, they would have probably got more than everybody off the ship. More than I would imagine they'd have got everybody off safely, if not the majority, because they had the lifeboat space, they had the lifeboats, they had the capacity, they had the capability. But again, like I said, a ship never waits for anybody, just like the Britannic never waited for anybody. Um, and it's amazing because the Britannic, people died because they were in a lifeboat. Titanic, people died because they weren't. See, Britannic, unfortunately, lives didn't have to be lost on Britannic because they had the lifeboat and the equipment to get people off swiftly. And that's what they did. But Britannic chopped up the lifeboats that were in the water because the ship was moving. The captain was trying to beat the ship. So although safety has improved on ships and this evolution has gone on from the Titanic, doesn't mean that necessarily it's going to save your life. Because look at the Wilhelm Gustloff, look at the Coast Concordia just recently. Lifeboats couldn't be because what happens is a ship has a list to one side. If a ship, because these ships tend to roll, and unfortunately, lifeboats, the majority of the lifeboats on the opposite side of the list become impossible to launch. Evolution has not just began with, just gone on from ships, but also from lifeboats themselves, because lifeboats have become safe for themselves too. Because when the Titanic was around and before the Titanic disaster, lifeboats didn't have any shelter. They didn't have no shelter from the elements because lifeboats were designed to be like tiny, ferries, because ships sink in shipping lanes. When a ship sinks, usually there's going to be help that comes along and helps everybody and rescues everyone. So there was no need for any protection from the elements. So there was no covers or anything to protect these passengers from the cold. Now we have boats that are motorized. You can actually move them without rowing them. You can have you've got boats that have got covers on them and that protect people from the elements, the cold. And now you have specifically on working ships, like commercial ships, they have like body warmers, you can actually put like jackets on, like full body jackets on suits. So if you go into the water, you're going to be protected for a certain amount for quite a few hours from the cold sea. So there's been this evolution of safety, but again, people have made the mistake. Even though there's been that evolution, doesn't mean it's going to guarantee your life. There was a vessel called the it was a fishing ship that went down in somewhere in America. It's gone out of my mind. And in fact, I believe there was a movie made about it called the Perfect Storm.
I heard about that one.
Yeah. Again, a ship never waits for anybody. And there was, there was that one, and there was another fishing ship where one of the skippers tried to get themselves in these life vests, these full-bodied light warmers, to protect them from the sea, and he couldn't get it fully on, and he couldn't zip it up because the ship just literally lurched over and threw him into the sea, and he died. He passed. He went. These. So again, even though there's been this evolution of safety, Again, a ship never, like I said, a ship never waits for anybody. The ship's going to sink. It's going to sink. It doesn't care who's on it or whatever. It's going to go down. And that is just one particular case of, you may have this thing that could save your life. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to save your life, because have you got the time to do it? Have you got the time to put it on? Have you got the time to get into a lifeboat or launch a lifeboat? There might be, every sea disaster have different circumstances and different situations that could prevent you from getting off safely.
Mm.
And that's what we have to remember. Mother Nature constantly has the upper hand. It doesn't matter what we build, doesn't matter how evolution changes from a sea disaster or even a plane disaster. We can learn when a plane crashes, but it has to take a plane to crash in the first place. Just like the Titanic took the Titanic to sink first before we ever learned anything, before we could start this evolution. A plane has to crash first before we learn from that disaster so we can improve, you know, air travel. But again, it doesn't, it, it doesn't, it doesn't always work, because I mean, something may have gone wrong in that plane, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same circumstance for the next plane that's going to crash. Mother Nature has the upper hand. That's what we have to remember.
Oh yeah, definitely. And we're going to wrap up this episode with one final thing because we got to think about the conclusion. What is your own conclusion on this, Jake? What do you believe now we've gone through everything?
All we've got to do is keep on learning. There is. I mean, I don't think there's ever going to be an end to it. There's never going to be an end to evolution and the way we learn. We're always going to be learning. There's always going to be. It may happen less these days than it did, say, in the early 20th century, but it will happen. Another sea disaster or something will happen, or a plane crash or car accident, or you know, we will always learn. There's never going to be an end to it. Never. That's my conclusion. We're always constantly going to be learning from disasters, from tragedies, and unfortunately, these tragedies take lives, or can or will take lives. You know, we can learn from, like, the Titanic, or the Derbyshire, which was um uh, 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 the largest, one of the largest container, not a container ship. It was a tanker. Oil. I think it carried oil or something, or I can't remember what it carried, but it was a gigantic ship. It was large, at least probably 200 foot longer than the Titanic. It was
Okay.
so big, and um, it hit a storm, and you know the hatch, it just there was no, like, protection from some of the vents that were on the decks, and the sea just washed over the ship and just added more weight to the ship, and it just literally plummeted to the ship, and it just imploded while it was under the sea as it was going down. It just boof boof boof. It's called a blowout, and it just obliterated the ship and anybody that was on it. No survivors. So again, and we're talking, that happened, what, I think in the 80s, I believe. So we're talking, what, 70 years after the Titanic. There's oh, you know there's a TV show called Drain the Ocean, and one of them is called Lost Giants, and it has the Britannic in it, of course, of all ships. It has the Britannic in it. It talks about how we're constantly learning, and there's no end to. We are constantly always putting our lives in the hands of Mother Nature,
Mm.
and sometimes Mother Nature catches us out. So every time we board a ship, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be safe. I mean, it's more safer now than it was years and years ago, 100 years ago, over a century ago. But there's always going to be something. You could be on the Disney ship, and that could hit a rock or strike something, and if it's got enough holes in it, it's going to go down. If it's, the Coast of Concordia can teach that. We just have to not be in fear of it. We just have to learn from it. So don't be afraid by getting on a plane or a ship, because I see it as if I'm on a ship that sinks. I know that I'm part of something that could eventually make seafaring slightly more safer, maritime, just that evolution. So that's my conclusion. Mother Nature has the upper hand all the time.
Yeah, that's the same thing. I couldn't really agree
She is
more.
that force, yes. And there's no
Yeah.
way of changing it. We
Oh,
just have to keep on going. People could walk out the front door tomorrow, and you're putting your life in your hand, even just in the comfort of your own home. We just have to go with the flow, and not be afraid. And me as a historian, I'm learning still about the Titanic. I'm still learning about the Britannic and all those. We're always constantly learning. Doesn't matter what it is. And that's the conclusion. There we go.
well, that's a brilliant conclusion. I really couldn't agree more. And yeah, but that's brilliantly said, Jake. Well done. And then I think with that, we're going to wrap up this episode here. Jake, thank you so much for coming
Thank
on
you.
today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking
It's been a
about.
pleasure.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to talk about more Titanic stuff soon. And Jake and I did another recording for the Titanic Titan and the Sea documentary, which
Yep.
we'll include footage in the documentary as well. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, it was a pleasure interviewing you a second time, Jake. And we'll
I
definitely.
know. It was fun. It always is. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And yeah, but what do you guys think? What do you think is your own conclusion to this theory? Do you agree with what we said, or do you have another conclusion in mind? Let's talk about
I,
it in the
I'm
comments on YouTube.
open-minded. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like send the comments in YouTube, Spotify, and anything, and let's get talking about it. I would really love to hear some of your
Yeah, I
ideas,
would.
and then we'll transfer it back and forth, Jake,
Yeah.
during that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Lovely.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
oh, you're welcome. And until then, everybody, I will be back tomorrow for another podcast episode for Titanic. And until then, stay safe and yeah, catch you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.